I want to move carefully here, because this is one of those stories where every word carries weight, and once it's spoken, it can't be taken back. You can feel it in the room before anything is said. There's no explosion, no dramatic interruption. Instead, the air tightens. Silence stretches just long enough to feel uncomfortable. This isn't hesitation born from uncertainty. It's hesitation born from consequence. The kind where someone is silently calculating how much fallout they're willing to absorb once the truth leaves their mouth. Then the question lands. Are you aware of what really happened to you? The answer should be simple. It isn't. No, I'm not. Not denial, not accusation, distance. That single response becomes the fault line everything else splits along, because when Tamar says she isn't aware of what really happened to her, the internet doesn't hear vulnerability. It hears omission. It hears something withheld. And Funky's someone who is actually there. He hears something else entirely. At first, his response isn't explosive. It's restrained, controlled, almost surgical. He skips past parts of the interview, not because they're irrelevant, but because he already knows where this is going. Then he turns directly to the camera, not as a commentator, not as a reactor, but as a participant. As someone whose name is already being dragged through comment sections he never asked to be part of. And when he calls her a liar, it doesn't sound like drama. It sounds like a fracture. A clean break between two versions of the same night within minutes. Clips spread, screenshots circulate, threads multiply. Viewers rewind and rewatch, stitching together fragments that don't quite line up. A birthday party that wasn't really a party. A night that keeps changing shape depending on who's telling it. Injuries described publicly but never fully explained. Then Funky does something critical. He stops talking about feelings and starts reconstructing the night. Not emotionally. Logistically, restaurants, car rides, who arrived unexpectedly, who sat, where, who went upstairs and who didn't. And when he says it directly, when he looks straight into the lens and says, "I'm telling you to your face, you were a bold-faced liar," the temperature drops instantly. Because now the story isn't about misunderstanding. It's about proximity, about silence, about why someone would claim confusion while simultaneously refusing emergency help, about describing blood and injury, then leaving everyone else to carry the weight of interpretation. Funky explains why he didn't follow Tamar inside her own home. And this is where everything shifts. He says Tamar and Mendeecees were kissing in the car. That single sentence detonates the narrative, because now the conversation stops being about abandonment and starts being about presence. If Tamar wasn't alone, then who was with her? And why hasn't that been addressed? The internet stops arguing tone and starts tracking movement. Comment sections flood. Some defend Tamar, some side with Funky, but almost everyone notices the same thing. One name keeps coming up. One person hasn't spoken, and one line refuses to fade. If anyone knows what happened upstairs, it wasn't the person who drove away. That implication changes everything. Because when stories don't add up, the internet doesn't wait for answers. It applies pressure, and Funky doesn't rush. He slows the story down until it can't hide anymore. He doesn't speculate about Tamar's emotions. He doesn't guess her intentions. He dismantles her timeline and replaces it with one built on sequence, location, and choice. Who called whom, where they went, how the night actually unfolded. His delivery is calm on purpose, because this isn't reaction, it's recollection. And that distinction matters, because the moment the night is reframed, Tamar's uncertainty begins to feel less like confusion and more like insulation. Funky starts by rejecting the foundation of her interview entirely. The birthday narrative. The idea that the night was about generosity. According to him, that framing isn't just inaccurate, it's strategic. He says there was no event, no celebration. Tamar and Zoe were just trying to find somewhere to eat. Everything near them was closed. They called him, he suggested Ruth's Chris, as a last resort. The night didn't begin as an occasion, it began as convenience. And that detail alone strips the emotional weight Tamar later attached to it. Then comes the first coincidence. One Funky doesn't label coincidence at all. As soon as he arrives, Mendeecees shows up, unannounced. No accusation, no dramatics. It's just a fact. And then another and another. Funky points out that Mendeecees had a habit of appearing unexpectedly during multiple hangouts. One instance could be chance. 3 establishes a pattern. Repetition removes plausibility. From there, the night fractures into motion. Plans change. Fatigue sets in. Funky says he wanted to go home. Others didn't. They rerouted from Buckhead. 2v12, that reroute matters, because it introduces a decision point. Funky makes it clear he didn't want to continue. He drove separately. He resisted the change. And yet, he was asked to abandon his car and ride with them instead. Why? He explains it plainly. After seeing Tamar and Mendeecees kissing in the back of the car, he assumed they wanted privacy. That's why, when they arrived at Tamar's house, he didn't go upstairs. He got in his car and he left. That explanation doesn't just reframe the night. It overturns the accusation that followed him publicly. The idea that he abandoned a vulnerable friend. That his absence implied negligence, according to him. He didn't leave because he didn't care. He left because he believed he wasn't alone. And that belief collides violently with Tamar's later portrayal of isolation and confusion. Funky doesn't claim to know what happened upstairs. He's careful not to. But he does say who went Mendeecees and his friend. That detail becomes the axis. Everything spins around, because it places proximity at the exact moment Tamar later describes injury, blood, and refusing emergency care. Funky revisits those claims, not to dismiss them, but to question their coherence. He recalls Tamar saying she woke up in a pool of blood, that she almost died. Then contrasts that with her admission that someone suggested calling an ambulance and she said no. That contradiction doesn't suggest nothing happened. It suggests whatever happened wasn't treated like an emergency by the person experiencing it. And that inconsistency fuels speculation, not because Funky invents it, but because Tamar leaves it open. As this portion spreads online, people begin layering meaning onto the gaps. The lack of explanation, the speed of recovery, the absence of names in Tamar's account contrasted with Funky's specificity. And in that vacuum, theories emerged, not as facts, as attempts to resolve cognitive dissonance. Funky never mentions tests. He never names worst-case scenarios. But his reconstruction gives those whispers something to cling to. The pressure doesn't just surround Tamar. It shifts. Toward Yandy, Funky mentions her once. Near the end, with restraint, he says the only person wronged was Yandy. That single sentence detonates another line of inquiry. Because if Yandy was wronged, then someone crossed a boundary. And if that boundary was crossed on a night filled with Yandy, a night filled with Yandy. With restraint, he says the only person wronged was Yandy. Says that any filled. Was Yandy saying that Basie, that Cinda side send a case? As Yandy says, we said, while we said, ly 6 second. Because you said, go on. That one with Yandy said, well, so quiet I is. So were we with Yandy with one Wandy, so can I you with kikik to say, I do we with you, can we see we to you, so I to can you with you, I sir with you, guy, or hide it, stick, you, if you, we, I, we do it, I just speak to guys. That's I do I can I think I right I have that secrecy, rerouted plans, and unexplained injuries. Then silence begins to look less like dignity and more like containment. Funky doesn't accuse crimes. He doesn't confirm outcomes. He doesn't describe what happened upstairs. What he does instead is far more destabilizing. He establishes who was present, who left, and who later claimed not to know. Once those coordinates are set, story no longer belongs to any one person. It belongs to the gaps. Shifting from emotion to a exposu re once Funky finishes laying out the timeline, the conversation online changes shape, stops being about tone, about delivery, about Mendeecees. It becomes about exposure. Viewers stop arguing new points and start replaying the same unresolved elements Tamar herself introduced, her own words about not knowing what happened, her public description of blood and injury, her refusal to involve emergency services. Funky didn't add those details. He simply refused to let them exist without consequence. And that's where the atmosphere darkens, not because of new revelations, but because nothing is clarified. The interview Tamar gave offered vulnerability without explanation, crisis without cause. In an environment already charged, that vagueness becomes combustibl. Audiences revisit her language, the way she framed the night as something that happened to her, the lack of transition between socializing and collapse. That absence becomes its own narrative. Speculation doesn't begin maliciously. It begins because humans seek coherence. And when coherence isn't offered, people assemble it themselves. Words start circulating, always framed as allegedly. According to blogs, people are saying repetition gives weight. The more Tamar remains silent, the more the pressure amplifies. She doesn't clarify her injuries. She doesn't explain the contradiction. She doesn't address the presence of others. Each omission becomes interpretive space, and the internet is never gentle with empty space. Funky draws a critical distinction. He doesn't say Tamar lied about being hurt. He says she curated confusion. That difference matters, because once intention is suspected, motive enters the conversation, and that's when Yandy's silence stops being peripheral. Not speaking begins to look like containment. People theorize that whatever Yandy knows, she knows privately. That revelation doesn't need to be public to be complete. That interpretation spreads because it aligns with the behavior pattern. People choosing what to say, what not to say, and when to withdraw. Language begins to shift. Words like court, testimony, liability enter the discourse, not because Funky mentioned legal action, but because his cadence mirrors something familiar. Statements made to withstand scrutiny. He recounts events in order, repeats phrases for accuracy, avoids dramatics. That tone suggests confidence, and confidence is contagious. Suddenly, Tamar's condition isn't discussed in isolation. It's discussed alongside responsibility, exposure. Who benefits from ambiguity? The narrative stops being about sympathy. It becomes about containment. The final pressure point by the time the story reaches this stage, it no longer moves forward. On information, it moves inward. People stop asking what was said and start asking why certain things were never said at all. Funky's account is rigid. Presence, discomfort, departure. Tamar's remains suspended. That suspension becomes the center of gravity. Sympathy fractures. Some argue trauma blurs memory. Others argue trauma doesn't coexist with selective clarity. Funky doesn't escalate. He stops, and that silence reads as confidence. Mendeecees' presence becomes unavoidable, not as accusation, but as relevance. Presence unaddressed becomes dangerous. When paired with injury and silence, the audience begins adjudicating credibility. Who benefits from ambiguity? Who absorbs damage? Who remains insulated? At this point, the story calcifies not into fact, but belief. Belief that something significant happened. Belief that silence is strategic. Belief that clarification would carry consequence. And belief, once formed, it is nearly impossible to reverse. So now the question shifts to you. Did Funky speak for attention, or because he was done carrying someone else's narrative? When Tamar says she doesn't know what happened, does that sound like trauma or strategy? When injuries are described publicly but never explained, is that protection or control? And Yandy, if she truly was the only one wronged, does her silence signal strength or fallout? If nothing serious happened, why does no one seem eager to clarify? Why does every gap feel intentional? And why does this story still feel unfinished? Drop your thoughts below. Timelines, interpretations, details people might be overlooking. Because stories like this don't disappear, they pause. This is where the story stops moving forward and starts pressing inward, because when everything that can be said has already been said and nothing is clarified, the question is no longer what happened. The question becomes, who can afford? Not to answer. At this point, Funky doesn't add anything new. And that absence becomes the loudest development of all, because if something he said was wrong, it would have been corrected. If the timeline was false, another one would have replaced. If someone's presence was irrelevant, it would have been denied. But nothing comes. And when silence is this complete, it doesn't feel accidental. It feels deliberate. The audience doesn't consume that silence passively. They analyze it. Every detail that could have been clarified but wasn't gets noted. Tamar doesn't revise her account. She doesn't explain the origin of her injuries. She doesn't address who was with her. It's in the final moments of the night. And when someone shares a public crisis but withholds context, the context doesn't disappear, it gets created. This is the moment sympathy begins to convert into pressure, because people start asking questions that can't be ignored anymore. If this was only confusion, why does clarity feel so expensive? If nothing serious happened, why does everyone seem so careful? At this stage, Tamar is no longer the center of the story. Ambiguity is . And ambiguity doesn't stay neutral. It damages everyone who allows it to exist. That's when Mendeecees' name re-enters the conversation, not as an accusation, but as proximity. Not because Funky accused him of wrongdoing, but because Funky placed him in the room. Presence becomes relevance. And relevance demands explanation. But again, there is none. No statement. No clarification. No context. In silence, once it crosses a certain threshold, stops being emotional and starts feeling procedural. The audience begins reading restraint as protection. Not protection of feelings, but protection from consequence. That's when language shifts. Words like liability, exposure, strategy begin to surface, not because anyone confirmed them, but because the behavior invites them. This is where the story stops behaving like entertainment. It starts behaving like exposure. Not exposure of facts, but exposure of risk. People begin to ask who benefits from uncertainty, who absorbs damage while others remain insulated, who spoke hand, who stayed untouched by the fallout. Funky's role crystallizes here, not as a hero, not as a villain, but as someone who accepted being labeled messy rather than letting the narrative write itself around him. And that choice matters, because silence didn't protect him, it punished him. And once the audience recognizes that, they begin to reassess everything they thought they understood. The idea that Funky abandoned someone vulnerable collapses. In its place emerges a more uncomfortable possibility that outrage was guided by incomplete information. Once that realization takes hold, the tone shifts again. Comment sections become quieter but sharper, less emotional, more analytical. People stop asking what happened upstairs and start asking why no one wants to talk about who was upstairs. And this is where the metaphorical courtroom fully forms. Not a legal one, but a cultural one. Credibility is weighed. Consistency is measured. Motives are inferred. Tamar's refusal to anchor. Her story in specifics begins to look less like trauma and more like management. Each time she says she doesn't know what happened, the audience assumes someone else does. And that assumption drifts toward the people who were present and remains silent. That's how Yandy becomes central without speaking. Funky's statement that she was the only one wronged reframes the entire situation. It suggests this wasn't just about injury, it was about betrayal. And betrayal doesn't need public explanation to be real, only needs consequence. By now, the audience isn't waiting for confirmation. They're tracking fallout. Who stopped appearing? Who stopped engaging? Who stopped correcting? And when they see withdrawal instead of denial, it reinforces the same belief. Whatever happened was serious enough to be contained at this point. The story has hardened into something else. It's no longer about facts. It's about behavior. Who spoke? Who didn't? Who clarified? Who avoided and once belief forms around behavior? No statement can fully undo it. This is where the narrative freezes, not unresolved, but suspended, because resolution would require someone to do what no one has done yet. Step forward. Name specifics. Accept consequence. Until that happens, the silence remains the loudest voice in the room. By the time the story reaches this point, stops asking for answers. It starts measuring cost, because nothing new is being revealed anymore. What's being revealed is who can stay quiet and who can't. The absence of response becomes heavier than any accusation ever was. Tamar doesn't clarify. Mendeecees doesn't contextualize his presence. Yandy doesn't step forward to close the loop. And Funky, having already absorbed the label of being messy, doesn't soften his position or walk anything back. That collective stillness becomes the loudest development of all. At this stage, the story stops behaving like content and starts behaving like consequence. Not because facts have been proven, but because risk has been exposed. People don't pull back when nothing is at stake. They pull back when the stakes are already defined. And that belief settles in quietly. The audience begins to sense that whatever exists behind the scenes isn't meant for public consumption. Not because it's trivial, but because it's too consequential to perform. This is where the idea of a courtroom symbolic, not literal, fully takes shape. The language shifts again. Not guilt, not innocence, but responsibility to remain. Who've benefited from silence? Who absorbed damage while others stayed protected? Funky's framing of himself as collateral damage becomes the emotional anchor of this phase. He positions himself not as the aggressor, but as the one who stayed quiet, while narratives formed around him. He describes being dragged publicly, painted as negligent, accused of disloyalty, all while withholding details he claims could have changed everything instantly. That restraint, whether strategic or emotional, repositions him in the eyes of the audience, because silence didn't shield him, it cost him. And once the audience recognizes that, they begin to reassess their own reaction. They revisit the assumption that Funky should have gone upstairs, that he abandoned someone vulnerable under the weight of his account. That assumption collapses. What replaces it is something far more unsettling: the possibility that the audience itself was guided toward outrage without full context. Once that realization takes hold, the tone of the conversation changes permanently. Comment sections stop being reactive. They become analytical. People stop choosing sides and start reconstructing motivations. Why would someone describe severe injury without naming cause? Why would proximity be omitted? Why would those closest to the situation choose silence over correction? And the most uncomfortable conclusion many arrive at is this: not that something criminal occurred, but that something reputational did. That boundaries were crossed in ways that can't be undone. That relationships were altered privately long before the public noticed. That what's being protected now isn't truth, it's fallout. This is where Mendeecees' role shifts again. Not from participant to perpetrator, that leap is never substantiated, but from background figure to unavoidable presence. The audience doesn't ask what he did. They ask why he hasn't spoken. and in modern media ecosystems. Silence from someone repeatedly named is rarely interpreted as emotional. It's interpreted as counsel-driven. That interpretation alone changes perception. Even if nothing formal ever happens, association leaves residue, and that residue sticks. Yandy's position becomes the emotional endpoint of the story. Funky's insistence that she was the only one wronged reframes everything around betrayal rather than injury. It suggests that whatever occurred had ripple effects beyond physical harm. That trust was compromised. That silence is not neutrality, it's damage control. The audience begins treating Yandy as the one person whose reaction would confirm everything, and whose silence therefore confirms nothing. That paradox sustains the story. If she speaks, it validates the weight of the moment. If she doesn't, it reinforces the belief that the truth is too volatile to release. So the narrative stalls at maximum tension. Tamar's condition remains undefined, serious enough to reference, vague enough to evade explanation. Mendeecees remains central to the timeline, close enough to matter, distant enough to avoid specificity. Yandy remains silent, present enough to anchor sympathy, removed enough to avoid performance, and Funky remains unchanged, having said what he said and refusing to chase validation. This is where the story stops progressing and starts calcifying, not into fact, into belief. Belief that something important happened. Belief that not everyone is being honest. Belief that silence is strategic. And once belief sets in, no clarification can fully reverse it, because the final shape of the story isn't built on evidence. It's built on behavior. Who spoke, who didn't, who explained, who deflected to, accepted damage, and who seemed protected from it. That's why this chapter ends without resolution, because resolution would require someone to do what no one has done yet: step into the open, name specifics, risk consequence. Until that happens, the story remains suspended, not unresolved, but unchallenged. And in that suspension, one truth becomes unavoidable. Whatever this was, it was never just a misunderstanding. It was a collapse, slow, quiet, and only visible once it was already complete. At this point, the story isn't asking for belief, it's asking for interpretation. You've heard what was said, you've seen what wasn't corrected, and you've watched how silence became the loudest response of all. So now the question shifts to you. Do you believe Funky spoke because he wanted attention, or because he was done carrying someone else's narrative? When Tamar says she doesn't know what happened, does that sound like trauma or strategy? When injuries are described publicly but never explained, is that protection or control? And if Yandy truly was the only one wronged, does her silence signal strength or fallout? Most importantly, ask yourself this: if nothing serious happened, why does no one seem eager to clarify? Why does every gap feel intentional? And why does this story still feel unfinished even after all the talking? Drop your thoughts below. Not just opinions, timelines, interpretations, moments that stood out. What detail do you think people are overlooking? What question still hasn't been answered? If you think this story is over, say why. If you think it's just entered a quieter phase, tell us what you're watching for next. Because stories like this don't disappear. They pause. Like the video if you're still weighing the silence. Subscribe if you're following where this goes next. And share this with someone who thinks this was just drama, because by now, it's clearly something else. We'll be watching.